Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Hypertrophy Past and Present. Thank you for joining us. And thank you to everyone who did that. I don't even know what it's called. Spotify. Is it Spotify Unwrapped? I think that's what it's called. I am an Apple user, but thank you to everyone who shared this podcast and tagged us and did all that stuff. We appreciated all of you. So thank you as always for doing the good stuff. So we're back with another episode. And Chris, how are you doing today before I jump into my plan?
I'm doing well, thanks, Jake. Good to be here.
Good to hear you're doing well. I think last time we spoke, you were a little bit sick, or maybe that was 2 weeks ago now.
Yeah, no, it was fine. It's just the turn of the seasons as it gets colder and rainier, and the flus and the sniffles start going around. I usually catch something briefly, but I'm definitely a lot better now.
Well, I made fun of you. I didn't make fun of you, but I made a comment at the time saying, "Oh, you get sick a lot," and you got a little bit offended at me for saying that. And I think karma's got me, and I'm feeling a little bit run down today, and I've got a bit of a sore throat. So that's what I get for making a comment about it. Anyway, I'm going to jump into it. Today I want to talk about one of the most iconic lifters of the silver era. Now, it is someone we've spoken about just once before. I was actually a little bit shocked to go back and realize that we've only ever talked about him one time because he was so influential as a silver era lifter, and that is a guy named John Grimek. And John Grimek is pretty remarkable. So he did win, just so people know, basically we started off with some of these like Mr. America type competitions, and Mr. Universe didn't exist yet. And Grimek was winning Mr. America in the early 40s. And then he was the first Mr. Universe competition winner. And there was like a couple of different Mr. Universe competitions that kind of erupted at a similar time. It's a little bit messy. I won't get into the politics of it now, but he did win Mr. Universe in 1948, and he was winning Mr. Americas in the early 40s. And what's cool about Grimek, and not just Grimek, but a lot of these early, I guess, Mr. Universe winners, Reg Park would be in a similar field, is I love looking at the skills that these lifters had. So we look at someone like John Grimek, and obviously amazing bodybuilder, first sort of Mr. Universe in 48, and, winning all these bodybuilding shows, but also such a gifted Olympic lifter, weightlifter. We look at the Olympics and the weightlifting team, and Bob Hoffman as the coach for the weightlifting team, literally calling Grimek up like a short time away from the Olympics and being ultimately like, hey, we need more lifters. Can you come and lift for us? And Grimek being in a position where he could actually step in and be competitive at a weightlifting Olympic level as ultimately a bodybuilder. Like, just unbelievable. We've got people like Reg Park who are benching 500 pounds as a bodybuilder. And, you hear people talk about bodybuilding today and how, does it compare to what we see in sort of strength field? And it doesn't seem to have or even to the point that people will make comments like, can I get strong doing bodybuilding training? And it's like, well, hang on. As a natural bodybuilder back in the day, they were literally the strongest people on the planet. So I love looking at people like Grimek. I love looking at people like Reg Park and seeing, hey, these guys who are training to ultimately be the best bodybuilder they could were naturally acquiring such high levels of strength that they were competitive at a global scale. So that's Grimek. And this plan is technically, you would say this is a post-steroid era plan, because he did write this down after he had experimented himself with anabolics. Now, I don't know if I covered this little bit of history when we first talked about it. Grimek was actually, presumably, if the information we have is correct, Grimek was actually amongst the first Americans to experiment with anabolics. And that happened in 1954. There was a team of maybe half a dozen or so York lifters who actually were part of that, I guess you would say, experiment. Reportedly, that first experimentation didn't particularly work out the way they I guess, hoped. And then it wasn't for a couple of years or a few years after that until it sort of produced results they were hoping for. So Grimek definitely did experiment with anabolics. Again, that was 1954. What impact it had at that point in time, maybe a little bit questionable. But then in the years following that, obviously, that's where we start to see the effect of anabolics, I guess, more obviously. So this plan was authored after anabolics were being used. And it was not a plan that Grimek was following himself. It was a plan that he recommended to people who wanted to gain muscular bulk or I guess, ultimately hypertrophy. So you could argue, is this a pre-anabolic plan? Is it a post-anabolic plan? Could it have been influenced by how things had been shifting with the use of gear? Potentially it might have been influenced. My assumption looking at this is, hey, this guy competed, like he'd stopped competing by the time he was experimenting with anabolics. I would assume that most of his programming principles had probably been consolidated at that point, and I would assume that he's probably programming in similar ways as he was doing himself when he was natural. So maybe I'm naive, but you guys can decide for yourself, does this look more like a pre-anabolic plan, or does it look like some of the post-anabolic plans we started to talk about and will continue to talk about in future episodes? So that was a long preamble. Let's talk about the plan. This is, like I said, a gaining plan or a hypertrophy plan, a bulking plan. And it began with squats. Now, he did use some supersets here. Now, I guess you could call it like an exercise pair in some of these. Usually they didn't involve a lot of time between the two exercises, but obviously they did involve, I guess, setting up that specific exercise. So he went from a squat, and his first set of squats was a set of 15, into the classic pullovers. So that's kind of a very common silver era method, squatting paired with pullovers. And generally these pullovers were not done for, I guess, max effort. They were kind of like a little bit lighter, and this was for a set of 15 as well. Now, he then went back to a squat, and now he's reduced the weight, okay? So he's increased the weight, reduced repetition. So he's doing like a, I guess, sort of descending repetition pattern here. So now he's doing a set of 10, and now instead of supersetting with pullovers, he's actually supersetted with dumbbell fly, which I think is a pretty interesting change, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure. He then goes back into a squat and now again continues reducing repetitions, and he now does a set of 3 to 5 repetitions and supersets that again with a pullover with a set of 15. So again, that lighter weight pullover. And then finally we go into barbell shrugs, two sets of again descending repetitions. So he does a set of 10 to 12 and then a set of 6 to 8, and then conventional deadlift, 2 sets of again 10 to 12 and then 5 to 6. So he's descending his reps on all of these. Then bent over barbell row, 2 sets, again set of 10 to 12 and 5 to 6. And then a barbell overhead press, 2 sets of 8 to 10, and then 3 to 5 for your second set. And then finally a barbell curl, a set of 8 to 10, and then a set of 3 to 5. So every exercise, except for the pullover, he's reduced repetitions in that second set, ultimately done about 2 sets per exercise, except for the squats. A bit different to other plans we've looked at so far. What do you think about that?
So presumably he's doing this 3 times a week.
Yes.
So this is a kind of classic full body program, same exercises done 3 times a week. This is, not that, the format of this feels slightly different from some of the other things we've looked at, but actually I don't think it's very far away in terms of the content and where you end up, because ultimately what he's doing 3 sets of squats, and in between his sets of squats, he's doing like a chest exercise. Now, the pullover really is a chest exercise. It's kind of a lower chest exercise, and then his fly is kind of a probably, everything exercise, but more so middle chest than upper or lower. So it's kind of a very much, squats with a very irrelevant, non-connected exercise done in between the sets of squats, I guess, while he's recovering. And interestingly, the choice of exercise that he's doing for the chest is quite non-demanding. Yeah. He's not doing barbell bench press between sets of squats. He's doing something that actually is not too, kind of onerous to perform. So you can kind of see why he's doing that. It's like, I'm recovering from my squats. I'm just going to do something easy rather than just sit around and stare at the wall. So I think that makes a lot of sense.
On paper, you're right. It does look quite different on paper to what we've seen, but in practice,
it's not going to end up being that different. It's not.
No, and the main difference, because they were always supersetting squats with pullovers anyway. So ultimately, The main difference here is he said, "Hey, one of those pullover sets, we're actually going to swap it for a fly," which is quite interesting if you think about what you're getting with the fly compared to the pullover. Yeah,
it's just moving away from the dogmatic idea that the pullover is designed to open up the rib cage, whatever nonsense they were thinking of. And it's like, well, no, it's just a chest exercise. So, kind of swapping it out with a dumbbell fly is totally logical if that's what you're doing the exercise for. So, it's consistent. I think it's just he's just playing a theme and variations rather than sticking with the original theme. So then he's going into, some back work, and it's really cool to see, like a couple of dedicated back exercises in these programs. I think ultimately this is the thing that is slightly different from what we do tend to. I mean, there are other programs with these exercises in. It's just that he's got three, together. He's got a shrug, he's got a deadlift, and he's got a barbell row. So that kind of really does emphasize that he is training back in a way that, a lot of the other programs we looked at do tend to be a little bit weak. They might have one of those three, but they might not have even two or three of them. And again, with a deadlift, we're getting some hamstrings training in there as well, which is something else that we tend to miss out on in some other programs. So really, I think the presence of back exercises and hamstrings exercises in this program is probably the most kind of different from the main bulk of programs that we've seen. And then, of course, finishing with an overhead press and a curl. So like when we were chatting about this before we came on the podcast, I was saying, really what I see as missing here, apart from the classic stuff that we always say, like the machines, because they just didn't have access to them or weren't using them or weren't accustomed to using them. So he hasn't got the knee extensions and the leg curls and that kind of stuff. He hasn't actually got any calf raises in here. Okay, fine. And he hasn't got any direct triceps work, and you would probably look at it and go, in comparison with many of the other programs we looked at, he's quite light on the pressing side of things. But if you look at it, the combination of overhead press and the fly and the pullover actually does kind of cover most of his bases if he's kind of maybe more on the triceps dominant side anyway. So, ultimately, I don't think actually that's kind of where I end up being very triceps dominant. It kind of would work for me. I don't need direct triceps work. It doesn't do anything for me because all my pressing is automatically triceps. So really, for me, I would be looking at this going, assuming that we can't access the knee extension and the leg curl and things like that, really I would go, you kind of probably want to put a calf raise in there, and you probably would want to have a pull-up in there. And that would be getting close to something that would work really well for me. Somebody else might need the direct triceps exercise or, a lateral raise or something, depending on what their sort of their leverages were. But I like it. I like it. I think it's a really nice program. Again, like I always say, whatever criticisms I offer of these programs, always in the context of it still being a pretty good program, better than 90% of what we see on the internet. Just a couple of minor quibbles, really.
It is interesting, the point about those chest exercises, because initially one might look at that and be like, oh, actually, that does feel quite light on with chest. There's no, flat bench, for example. And Grimek didn't do a whole lot of benching anyway, so I'm not surprised that we don't see that. But in fact, when you do look at it in a little bit more detail, and you've got the fly, you've got the pullover, and you've got the overhead press, you realize that actually for a particular person, that's quite a robust or a well-developed chest program anyway, isn't it?
Totally. I mean, like for people who, sort of perhaps are, as I say, triceps dominant and they don't need direct triceps work, they're getting all of that from the overhead press anyway. I think, putting those couple of chest exercises in with the dumbbell fly and the pullover probably gets you most of the way there. And again, it's just like, as an Olympic lifter, he probably wouldn't really need a lot to work on delts anyway, because he's probably able to get that from his overhead work. So yeah, I think he's got a really nice program for him. Could you make it slightly better? Yeah, sure. How much of that would require, machines? Probably most of it. But yeah, there's a couple of things. But again, like I say every time, or hopefully nearly every time, this is a great program. It's just minor details we'd want to sort of address.
A couple of things I really like about this, which, I'm biased because what I like about them is the reason that I program them myself, is firstly that he's doing, for all these exercises except for this squat, he's doing 2 sets. And I like that 2 sets as a sweet spot for a lot of people. And what I find interesting that we do see with a lot of these silver area plans is often when someone, not all the time, but often when someone does do more than 1 or 2 sets, it's often in the squat. And as you've identified, they're not doing leg extensions at this point almost ever. And so it tends to be in the exercise or in the muscle group that they're only training with 1 exercise, really. Most of these other muscles are usually getting trained with 2 exercises. So I find it interesting that they're weighting a little bit more volume towards the muscle group, which is a little bit more limited in what it's actually getting trained by, for starters. And I also like this descending repetitions where if we're using barbells, like most of this plan is barbells, a couple of dumbbell exercises, but mostly barbells, that first set of about 10 repetitions, I find that a really nice spot where a lot of the time, if you've done an exercise that maybe uses some of those muscles earlier in the workout, that next exercise where you're doing a set of 10, it may not even need any warm-up sets. Maybe it needs one at most. And so to start with that set of 10 and then go into this heavier set of 5 or whatever he's doing, depending on the exercise, I find that quite a nice sweet spot where you're minimizing setup. You're not having to load the bar so heavy in that first set. You're minimizing warm-up sets, but then you're also getting that nice heavy second set that is sort of mitigating some of that fatigue that might be coming along. And you're getting 2 sets, which, arguably is maybe the best, I guess, return on investment in terms of potential fatigue mechanisms and stimulus.
Yeah, the combination of practical and physiological factors there, I think, is persuasive, doing it that way around. I have to say, though, when it comes to machines where the warm-up isn't such a big practical component, I really prefer to do it the other way around.
Yes.
I'd really much rather do my heavy set and then back off and do a lighter set, well, not light, but moderate reps, sort of 8 to 10, after doing it like a 5 or a 6.
Yeah.
I think that's much, much preferable. But yeah, totally understand that when you've got practical considerations with barbells, the other way around does seem to work a lot better.
Yeah, I think for me, it's heavily dependent on how many warm-up sets would that exercise need. Because even like there's some machines where you may need more or fewer warm-up sets depending on what that exercise is as well. And certainly if it's an exercise, like for me, a lateral raise machine, I love that. You can just immediately go heavy, do one warm-up set, go heavy, do the stack, whatever, and you're not sort of limited by having to do these sort of step loading warm-up sets. But then, obviously if you're doing a barbell overhead press or something like that, it's going to be a little bit different. So I do think it's easy to overlook some of those practical components when you're just looking at it on paper, and then you go into the gym, you give it a go, and you're like, oh, that's why they did that maybe.
Totally. So we've always got to have that mindset when we look at these older programs, because those were the limitations that they were working with. So we can't just superimpose our expectations based on the fact that we can stroll into this wonderfully equipped gym and have any of the machines that we want accessible to us. That's just not the world they were living in.
I want to finish by saying one more thing about John Grimek that I think is quite interesting, and then we're going to talk about what the topic is for this episode. Grimek, I think maybe I've mentioned in the past when we did talk about him that he grew up doing single sets. Like his early career, he only ever did single sets. Multiple sets didn't particularly exist at that point. And to the point that he tells in an interview, he recalls that when he started training, he said, someone actually asked him, like, hey, how many sets were you doing in this program when you were starting this plan that you began with? And he literally goes, sets. We didn't even have that word. We did not use the word sets. We didn't know what sets were. So a lot of these old workouts, and this is not an example of this, but a lot of the workouts you might see in books, they don't specify sets because they literally didn't exist. And it's really easy. A mistake I see a lot of people make online is they'll then hear later interviews with people, whether it's Grimek or Steve Reeves or some of these bodybuilders, where some of these people might say, oh, I did 3 sets, I did 2 sets, I did whatever. And then they go back and they find these old plans before sets existed where this individual was in fact performing a single set, and they superimpose that, 3 sets, 2 sets, whatever. So the amount of plans that I've personally seen online of some of these very old plans where I know that these people were doing single sets, and then the people online have said, oh, no, they've said 3 sets next to each exercise or whatever, because they've taken that later sort of snippet of an interview or whatever. Just a point I wanted to make, because I see this all the time, especially with some of these early Mr. Universe competitors where actually, no, these plans, they don't specify sets because they didn't do sets. They just were doing single sets. Anyway, just a bit of a tangent. Today, we are talking about MPS.
We are, muscle protein synthesis. So this is a question that's been rumbling around in the fitness industry for quite a long time. It reached a bit of a peak in its sort of in the interest levels that people had for it a while back, a couple of months ago, and maybe a little bit longer. And it persists in being an area that people just don't understand. And I think there's a really big blind spot, especially as to what is being measured and what it means. So I just want to tackle part of that problem, part of that debate today. Essentially, we've got two kind of things to think about to start with. What it actually is, and then what we're measuring. So essentially, what it is when we talk about muscle protein synthesis or myofibrillar protein synthesis, we're talking about the rate at which proteins are being literally synthesized, so built or made inside the muscle fibers that we're interested in. Now, we can kind of measure that, but what researchers are basically trying to get at is a proxy for the extent to which hypertrophy is happening. And that's a slightly separate question, and that's where people are kind of getting tripped up, because ultimately, every muscle fiber has a rate of muscle protein synthesis that is going on in the background all the time, and it will go up and down according to the stimuli that it's experiencing and the conditions in which it's sitting in. We've also simultaneously got a muscle protein breakdown rate, which is going in the opposite direction. So you've got synthesis, building, and then breakdown, which is the destruction. So you've got these two opposing rates. Now, technically, if you have a synthesis rate that equals your breakdown rate, then you're basically just going to have nothing happening all the time. Now, a long time ago, in research terms, when hypertrophy researchers were looking at what happened in the post-workout period, they noticed that muscle protein breakdown rates didn't change, astronomically, and that the muscle protein synthesis rate was the thing that really jumped, especially in the first kind of, 4 to 8 hours post-workout. So they kind of said, look, we don't feel like we need to go to the trouble of measuring muscle protein breakdown rates all the time, because when we're thinking about the hypertrophy stimulus that's being produced by a workout, we think that muscle protein synthesis rate changes are the best way of describing it, because actually, muscle protein breakdown are a separate measurement. It's actually a lot harder than muscle protein synthesis to measure. And so as a result, it's a lot easier and cheaper to construct your experiment only measuring muscle protein synthesis and not measuring muscle protein breakdown if you want to gauge how much stimulus you're getting from a particular workout. Now, for reasons that we can get into later, that's not a horrible way of doing things if you're only interested in, the kind of the immediate post-workout period of, like, say, the first 12, 24 hours, or maybe that kind of broadly sort of defined period. What you can't do, and what people are starting to do, and they're getting tripped up, is to extend things outside of that period and go, muscle protein synthesis rates are always indicative of hypertrophy, of the extent to which hypertrophy is happening. That is going to cause you some serious problems, and you're going to end up in a lot of difficulty if you do that, because muscle protein breakdown rates can move around a lot, and they can, depending on the situation. I'll explain what those situations are in a moment. And so if people come into a scenario and go, oh, look, MPS is elevated or MYOPS is elevated, and they don't think about what else is happening in the scenario, and we're kind of drifting outside of that first 12 to 24-hour period post-workout, you're really not going to get the answer you're expecting if you just look at MPS. You're going to have to look at MPS and muscle protein breakdown at the same time. Otherwise, you're not getting the right answer to understand what's happening in terms of the net, what I call the net protein balance of that period of time that you're investigating. So what I'm clarifying here is that when we're looking at studies that are measuring MPS or MYOPS in the post-workout period, it's technically not correct, truly correct, to say that MPS is a perfect reflection of what's happening, but it broadly is in the first 12, 24 hours. When you go outside of that period, it really isn't, for reasons that we can get into in a moment. So is this making sense so far?
Yeah, great. So you're saying the first sort of 12-ish hours, we're not seeing a significant change in muscle protein breakdown yet, yes?
Yeah, so ultimately, as I've said a number of times, and I know it remains contentious in some parts of the science-based lifting community because they're looking at the wrong kind of metrics, but if you look at direct markers of muscle damage, they don't exist in the first 6 hours at all. There just isn't any muscle damage there. Muscle damage really is pretty limited. It takes time to develop. Calpain production takes time to develop to the point when it's actually creating damage. And then you have the inflammatory response that kicks off after that. So we're not really creating much damage until the kind of back end of that first day and spilling over into the second day normally. The exact timeline varies because really the amount of damage you create determines how quickly it gets processed. If you create a very minimally, if your workout is minimally damaging, let's say you do a couple of clusters and contractor position exercises and that's it, then you're going to create so little damage that, yeah, it will get processed faster. If you create a lot of damage, if you do a whole bunch of eccentrics, for example, you're probably going to be spilling out past the second day before it really finishes getting processed. And muscle protein breakdown is kind of like your first clearance sort of metric. It's going to start pulling all of the stuff out that you don't need. So you're going to see an increase in muscle protein breakdown at the point when you've got damaged tissue to remove. So ultimately, that isn't something you're going to see happening early on in the post-workout period. So we tend to kind of associate it with a more delayed effect.
And when we're looking at MPS and muscle protein breakdown, especially in the context of like post-workout, is that telling us systemic levels? Is it telling us fiber levels? Is it telling us muscle levels? What are we actually seeing with those numbers? What's being measured?
So when you take, well, it depends on the experimental model. So if you look at the experiments that researchers are doing today in humans, then they take biopsies. So they will literally take a muscle biopsy and then they'll, kind of assess that piece of tissue that they've removed from the body. So what you're getting there is an index of literally the muscle tissue that you've just pulled out of the body. So it's very, very specific to the exact area. So you can kind of run into difficulties there if you're taking stuff from the wrong part of the muscle. And there's all kinds of issues associated with that. But, let's not kind of be too critical of that because they're just problems that we always face with that kind of analysis. In older studies, what you'll find is that they actually do more systemic measurements, but in those scenarios, and so they're usually taking kind of measurements of what's happening in the blood. They're taking measurements of what's happening in the blood in terms of nitrogen balance. So that is really a separate type of experiment. It's not very commonly done anymore, but it kind of gives you a more systemic kind of view on what's going on. Depending on the model, that's valid. You wouldn't want to do it if you were just training one muscle. It's kind of more for a whole body type immobilization scenario. That's really good because, of course, the entire body is immobilized. So you can kind of get this interesting systemic effect across the whole body of what's happening in terms of muscle protein breakdown in that scenario, or muscle protein synthesis in that scenario. You get an idea of whole kind of body protein balance in that a specific situation. And as I say, immobilization, bed rest, as in true, like not immobilization for a limb, but bed rest is a really nice way of assessing that because you do have that whole body kind of sort of assessment. You also have that if, for example, somebody has a traumatic injury and they get hypercortisolemia as a result of that traumatic injury. Again, you're going to see a muscle protein breakdown effect that affects the whole body. Again, measuring that systemically is an interesting way of doing that because you've got whole body effect happening. Totally different from what you'd be talking about if you were like just doing biceps curls. You would never want to do that in that situation. You'd want to take a biopsy.
Yeah, great. Okay. And presumably when we're looking at things like, say, nutritional studies and they're looking at proteins affecting MPS.
Exactly. Well, you can. You can do it. It depends what you're doing. Like if you're measuring like the effect of protein feeding on a strength training workout stimulus, so whether it has a cumulative effect, then you still go down the biopsy route because you'd want to be like, I've just done 10 sets of knee extensions or whatever silly program that they tend to do, like whatever number of sets of knee extensions, and then you eat like some protein and then you see what the compound effect of eating that protein is on the protein synthesis rates inside the quadriceps muscle. So, it depends on the nature of the study. But yes, you're right. You could also go down the systemic route if you were just, say, for example, you would, again, back to the immobilization study, if you were saying, if I eat some protein while I'm in an immobilized state, does it protect me from losing muscle mass? Which it doesn't, but does it change muscle protein balance in that scenario?
Perfect. Okay, so we've got the first 8-12 hours post-workout. Then where do we go to next?
So what I'm saying is that the studies that we tend to look at regarding the post-workout muscle protein synthesis response or MYOPS response, most of them run to, kind of like anywhere up to 24 hours. And in that period of time, that's fine. You're kind of looking at a period of time in which hypertrophy is mostly being stimulated in that window, not really much beyond that. After that, you've got other stuff going on. But as I say, extrapolating the muscle protein synthesis responses from that particular scenario. So number one, it's immediately post a strength training workout. And number two, it's a short period of time after that strength training workout. You can't sort of extrapolate that and say, any time muscle protein synthesis is elevated, we're experiencing a anabolic effect. And therefore, we're in a sort of a hypertrophy experiencing scenario. So what a lot of people are doing is they're saying any time MPS is elevated above a level that I would expect just from walking around, anytime that's happening, I'm in a protected state and the muscle is not going to be atrophying. And that is not correct because outside of this very specific scenario, which is immediately post-workout, you've actually got other stuff going on in which you might be experiencing a balance between muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown that's ending up being negative rather than positive. So what I'm saying is we've got a set of studies that look at MPS or MYOPS in a very specific time window after a very specific kind of event, which is a strength training workout, in like usually either untrained or lightly trained people and without other weirdness going on. So you're not measuring things like where somebody's sleep deprived or stressed or in caloric restriction. I mean, there are a couple of studies that have done that in caloric restriction, but the majority are done like, in a standard kind of situation where people are in calorie balance. So as soon as you start messing around with those variables, you're changing what's happening and your assumptions now are not going to be valid compared to, the majority of the literature that you're referencing. So I'm just kind of trying to get people to think about when they're talking about MPS, if they're referencing that body of literature, and there's like a dozen or so studies that have been done in this area, so people do reference them. It's like if you're referencing post-workout MPS rates or post-workout MYOPS rates, which are all kind of in that first 24-hour period post-workout in, people that are just living a normal life without trying to do diets or anything crazy like that, it's going to give you one set of results, and you can't extrapolate that necessarily to a whole bunch of other scenarios. So adding to that, I just want to kind of very quickly throw in another observation to just kind of further detach this idea that anytime MPS or MYOPS is elevated, you're automatically in a kind of a hypertrophic or anabolic state. So I've documented this like a dozen times. I keep telling people this, and it just seems to keep flying over people's heads, and they just like they nod at me and like, yeah. And then they go back to just ignoring what I've said. So I've said this a bunch of times, so let me say it again. There's 4 really clear scenarios in which we can elevate MPS or MYOPS and not experience hypertrophy afterwards. So let me just list these out, and then we can kind of talk about something more interesting afterwards. But I keep saying this, I'm just going to say it again. So if you have what I call a non-exercise muscle injury or non-exercise muscle damage. So there's a whole bunch of different models that researchers use in the literature. You can do this in a number of ways. Probably the most elegant is like a minor contusion model. And all this involves is like usually a plastic PVC pipe pointing downwards, and there's like the animal muscle is just at the bottom of the pipe, and then you drop a very small weight like a ball bearing down the pipe, and it produces a small bruise on the muscle of the animal. And in fact, they're starting to develop this model in humans now. So they literally just got a pipe that they put on the quadriceps muscle, and they drop a small weight, and you like go, ow. And then like you get a small bruise in a very localized way in a very controlled amount, and then they measure what happens to the body after that, experiencing that non-exercise muscle injury. And you get an elevation in MPS. Now, interestingly, it's delayed. It's delayed by 24, 48 hours, depending on how much injury there was created. So you tend to see that, like I was saying earlier, you don't see it immediately like you would do with a hypertrophic stimulus. It's pushed outwards, but you still get an elevation in MPS or MYOPS. It's not creating hypertrophy. I hope that people don't think that it's creating hypertrophy. Really don't want people to go taking that idea away. I don't want to be responsible for that. So, it's very much a muscle damage response, and MPS is being elevated, of course, to replace the previously damaged tissue. So non-exercise muscle injury, great example of when MPS is elevated, not creating hypertrophy. Now, just to answer a criticism that has been raised, some people have said, oh yes, but that doesn't involve an mTOR response. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. So mTOR, again, is involved in the signaling of muscle damage repair in the same way that it's involved in the signaling of hypertrophy. You can't say that the MPS elevation in muscle damage not caused by exercise is different from the muscle damage caused by exercise or the hypertrophy caused by exercise. mTOR is elevated in both scenarios. Exactly the same. There is no difference between the two. So when people are saying, oh yeah, they're separate things because mTOR is different, no, it's not. And I've done a whole FAQ on that. So that's just a non-exercise muscle damage. You can also get an MPS increase from eating protein. Now, this is the one that really people get confused about because they go, okay, so if I eat protein post-workout, it enhances the post-workout hypertrophy response. And okay, fantastic. So protein is anabolic. Well, no, it's synergistically anabolic if you add it to the body during a post-workout period. It's not anabolic on its own. So if you don't do any strength training and you just eat protein, it's not going to have that same anabolic effect and create hypertrophy, but it still elevates muscle protein synthesis. So it's elevating the rate at which you're replacing proteins, but it's not adding new tissue on top of what you've already got. Does that make sense?
Mm.
So you can absolutely create an MPS elevation with eating protein, but it doesn't have to create hypertrophy if you don't eat that protein, while you're concurrently performing a strength training program. So again, like MPS is being elevated here, it's not leading automatically to hypertrophy. So there's that disconnect there, which people are essentially at the moment denying. They're saying, anytime MPS is elevated, we're getting hypertrophy. I'm like, no, you're not.
So I don't want to jump the gun, but if that happens, to say someone didn't do a strength training workout and they ate more protein and MPS was elevated, like what happened is that MPS is wasted? Is there an increase in muscle protein breakdown to make up for that?
Yeah, exactly. What you're doing is you're accelerating protein turnover. So you're basically getting an in and an out. But you're essentially just replacing stuff that's already there. There's no signal to actually add on top of what you've already got. Mm-hmm. That's the missing piece. That's the bit that people miss. They're like, what is mechanical tension doing? It's telling you that you're going to be adding new stuff. If you don't have the mechanical tension signal, or arguably the anabolic steroid signal, but that's a separate question. If you don't have that, then what you're going to find is that you end up just turning over the stuff that you've already got. It's just going to be in and out, in and out. It's not going to be, adding on top of what you've already got. So you will see the elevation in MPS or MYOPS. You're not going to then pass that all the way through to what you're expecting, which is an increase in muscle tissue.
And in that situation, that MPS elevation, is that are we seeing that across sort of all muscle fibers? Are we seeing that that's more, we're just measuring that systemically? How do we see that in terms of protein?
So again, this depends on the model that the researchers have taken. So if you're taking a biopsy, it's usually going to be in the context of doing a strength training workout because they're training specific muscles. So you would expect them to look more systemically if they were kind of looking at whole body effects of protein feeding without it being a specific exercise stimulus. You'd probably expect them to use a more kind of systemic measurement. But honestly, that is nutrition science. That's not something that I spend a lot of time reading. So
was that 2 so far? 2 times?
So yeah, so we've had two things that we've covered so far. So what I've tried to do there is cover the 2 that I think are most interesting because they're completely non-exercise related. The last 2 or the second 2 are slightly closer to exercise. So aerobic exercise, you can get elevations in MYOPS for days post-workout. And interestingly, this is the one that's really tripped people up. So people used to rave about a study that had elevated MYOPS for 72 hours post an aerobic exercise workout. And they used to run around going, see, look, we've got this hypertrophy stimulus period that's lasting 3 days. Okay, so straight away, they've fallen into both traps that I outlined at the beginning of this conversation, where I said, first trap is that MYOPS studies that are linked to, that are done in the post-workout period, where you've got connections with long-term hypertrophy, they're really assessing that first 24-hour period primarily. And secondly, they're done immediately post-strength training workouts. So they've fallen into both of those traps because they've tried to extrapolate that knowledge base to A, an aerobic exercise workout, and B, a 72-hour period. So it just doesn't work like that. So what's happening is that aerobic exercise workout is producing a muscle damage, which is taking time to repair. And as we've talked about before, muscle damage takes a lot longer to fix than hypertrophy takes to implement. So you can create hypertrophy really quickly. Muscle damage repair is a much, much slower process. So there's a really nice pair of studies which has looked at post-workout MYOPS rate elevations after a kicking style activity. And they also did the same activity for a long-term training program and produced 0 hypertrophy. They also produced some really interesting resistance to fatigue adaptations that are, definitely worth thinking about. There's some interesting buffering capacity changes going in there relating to metabolite fatigue processes. There was stuff going on. It was a stimulus that was creating some fatigue resistance adaptations, but it wasn't translating to any hypertrophy. As I say, the same kind of workout produced a post-workout MYOPS rate elevation, or MPS, I forget exactly which one it was. But ultimately, you've got this kind of demonstration that aerobic exercise doesn't produce meaningful muscle growth, if any, and ultimately yet still produces that post-workout MPS or MYOPS rate elevation. And then finally, you've got static stretching. Now, this is like an advanced level topic. So if this doesn't make sense to you, then it doesn't matter. Just go and read the FAQ. Basically, when we talk about the muscle growth that happens from static stretching, it's sarcomerogenesis. It's not strictly hypertrophy. It's not an increase in diameter. It doesn't add myofibrils in parallel. It's not the same thing. Even though the hypertrophy researchers call it stretch-mediated hypertrophy, it's actually something different. It's sarcomerogenesis. You're adding sarcomeres in series. If you look at the sarcomerogenesis literature, you can see that you can have sarcomeres being added in series simultaneously with myofibrils in parallel being lost. So you're actually getting atrophy happening on a whole muscle level because you're reducing the number of myofibrils in parallel, but simultaneously you're still adding sarcomeres in series because you're holding the muscle in a stretched position, usually in a mobilized state. If you look at those immobilization studies where they kind of take a muscle and they kind of put it in a splint or in a cast, then what you see is that you, over the period of a couple of weeks, you're adding sarcomeres in series, and as I say, simultaneously atrophying the muscle. MPS is absolutely off the charts in those scenarios. It is just ridiculously high because, you've got this huge stimulus being applied every second of every day. So MPS jumps and it comes down as the stimulus reduces because you're adding more sarcomeres in series, which is relieving the passive tension that you were previously experiencing. And you end up back kind of in an equilibrium state after a week or two or whatever the period of time is. So static stretching or stretch-induced muscle growth, or, kind of arguably, is it muscle growth? Well, it technically is adding sarcomeres in series, so it is new muscle tissue you're adding, but you're simultaneously losing even more in other places because you've got this atrophy effect happening because of the immobilization. Really, static stretching completely, or the immobilization models completely destroy all ideas that you could have, always a hypertrophic stimulus whenever you've got MPS rates elevated, because literally the studies in immobilization studies show that anytime you have sarcomerogenesis being produced, you've also got this big MYOPS rate elevation happening. But simultaneously, you're actually also losing muscle tissue on a mass. Like if you're measuring it by mass, you're actually losing mass over the course of the study because you're losing faster. You're losing myofibrils in parallel faster than you're adding sarcomeres in. So those are the four things. Basically, it's just like those hopefully disconnect this idea that you can just simply elevate MYOPS and always be in an anabolic state. Just doesn't work like that.
And some of those have been studied in humans. Obviously, the protein and the aerobic elevation MPS have both been shown in humans.
I think we're going to get non-exercise muscle injury soon. As I say, there is definitely at least one study out there where people have been dropping small weights onto quadriceps muscles in people and getting some early indications of muscle damage. They're pretty, what I would call, weak measurements in terms of not the quality of the way that the measurements have been done, but just in terms of what they're telling us. The data that's been collected isn't very useful, but it's moving in that direction. So I would hope that we would have in a year or two some interesting non-exercise muscle damage data in humans as well.
Okay, so it's not contentious really to say that, MPS can be elevated without hypertrophy occurring.
Well, I don't think so. But, I've sat and listened to hypertrophy researchers basically say that whenever MYOPS is elevated, the muscle is in an anabolic state. And I'm like, that is so easy to falsify. 4 different ways I've presented that you can falsify that statement. And it just proves my point, which is that hypertrophy research is very siloed at the moment. It's in a silo. They literally read their own 20, 30 studies and they don't seem to read anything outside of that area. And it's like literally just go and look at sarcomerogenesis, go and look at some fatigue literature, go and look at some of the medical, muscle damage literature. Get yourself out of the immediate area that you've been reading in, and you'll immediately see that your basic assumption is false. And I can tell you why you made it. You made it because you've, a long time ago, decided that this post-workout window was enough to measure just muscle protein synthesis. You need to measure anything else. If you look outside of that particular window with those conditions, that assumption is no longer valid. So what I want to move on to now, though, which I think is something that I've not talked about much before, which builds on the podcasts that we've been doing over the last few weeks, where we've talked about things like sleep, we've talked about stress and caloric restriction and all those things that produce glucocorticoid responses. I just want to talk a little bit about some of the data that we've got in both animals and humans. So this is not, I know that some people sort of switch off when I start talking about physiology relying heavily on animal models. So I'm actually going to, kind of focus mainly on a set of studies that have been done on humans quite a while ago. And this research laboratory did a series of studies in a number of different scenarios, and they measured simultaneously muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown, and they got a net protein balance in each scenario. Now, these guys are not a laboratory that you're likely to come across naturally when you're doing your reading into hypertrophy, because they're actually focused on atrophy. They're focused on things like bed rest. They're focused on caloric restriction. They're thinking about hypercortisolemia, so sleep restriction, and they're thinking about what happens in traumatic injury. So let me just give a very quick overview of what their studies have kind of shown us. So essentially, they've found that you get sort of a negative protein balance. So breakdown is bigger than synthesis in a number of scenarios. You get it in immobilization. So bed rest is their typical model for that. They're not doing immobilization where they put a limb in a cast because they're not thinking about single muscles. They're thinking about all of this on a whole body level, really. So they look at bed rest as their immobilization model. They look at caloric restriction. So they just say, what happens if we start fasting, for example, because they're looking at extremes because they want to test. So don't run away with the idea that this is about, what happens when you start dieting a little bit. This is about pushing the boundaries to see, what happens in glucocorticoid scenarios where the lack of calories is a stressor now, not something that is just kind of like a mild kind of effect. So they're looking at bed rest, they're looking at fasting, and then look at what we call experimental hypercortisolemia, which is basically like kind of a glucocorticoid, an exogenous glucocorticoid response. So you kind of get a kind of like a corticosteroid. And then they look at, obviously this is a limited experimental model because you can only do it when, people come into the hospital with an accident. But if somebody has an accident and they get injured, then obviously they tend to be on a hospital bed, and it kind of combines them being in bed rest with a massive glucocorticoid response simultaneously. So obviously when you have a traumatic injury, the body just floods everything with cortisol. So you get this really big kind of hypercortisolemia effect. So you can look at all of these different scenarios. And now this laboratory have taken the same exact measurements in a number of scenarios, so you can kind of put them all next to each other and go, these are pretty comparable in the way that they're being formed. You're not comparing, one MPS measurement from one laboratory with an MPS measurement from another laboratory. They're all the same guys doing the same experiments, and so it's all pretty comparable. Now, in that context, if we just look at some of these numbers, what you see is that immobilization has a really interesting feature. Now, we know from other data in humans that's been measured more recently that the main reason why we experience atrophy during immobilization is because MPS tanks. It just drops to almost nothing. So this has been one of those discoveries that has kind of fed the idea that MPS is the only thing that matters. So when hypertrophy researchers look at, very briefly I imagine, the immobilization literature, they kind of see one study or two studies that say, oh, look, immobilization, the reason we lose muscle mass is because of MPS dropping. They're like, oh, yeah, that confirms my bias. Let me go back to, whatever it is I was doing before. And they just go, MPS is the only thing that matters. Yeah, immobilization, you get a massive drop in MPS back to almost nothing. Interestingly, if you look at MPB, muscle protein breakdown, it also decreases down to almost nothing. You still get a net negative protein turnover, so you're still losing muscle size, but the actual net protein balance, you're still getting pretty minimal, you're still getting a loss of muscle protein tissue, but you're actually also getting pretty minimal turnover. And those are separate questions. So what we're seeing is not only, in immobilization situations, is not only do we see net protein negative scenarios, we're actually losing muscle tissue. We're also seeing pretty low MPS, pretty low MPB. So the overall turnover is pretty small. So it is a muscle loss scenario. It's just one of those muscle loss scenarios where the actual ins and outs aren't very big at all. Now,
presumably, though, the MPB must be, the MPS is reduced more.
Just bigger. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the MPB, but the thing is, if you're coming at this from a perspective of your hypertrophy kind of bias, you would look at it and go, yeah, so I'm expecting MPS to be the primary driver of whether the muscle is in an anabolic state. So when it drops, that's confirming what I'm expecting to see. No problem at all. That is exactly in line with expectations. The interesting thing is, though, that when you look at sort of going from a normal state to fasting, again, MPS drops, but fasting, like we talked about in the caloric restriction scenario, long-term fasting to somebody who's unaccustomed to it is actually going to be a stressor. So you actually experience a drop in MPS, but you experience a really big increase in MPB as well. So if you were just looking at the change from normal calorie balance walking around to fasting walking around, you would actually see a relatively small decrease in MPS that you were like, how does that explain what I'm seeing in terms of atrophy? But it doesn't, because you're actually getting this really big increase in MPB, which is accounting for a bigger portion of your net protein loss. So your turnover is a lot bigger in caloric restriction than it is in mobilization. It's just, again, you've got these differences in MPS and MPB happening in comparison with what you would see in normal life, just day-to-day walking around. But what's really interesting is when you start to push the territory into scenarios like hypercortisolemia and a traumatic injury, which is like supposed to be the kind of the real-life analog of experimental hypercortisolemia. The really interesting thing about traumatic injury plus bed rest is it looks absolutely nothing like bed rest on its own. So experimental hypercortisolemia, which is the exogenous application of corticosteroid, and traumatic injury actually look pretty much the same. So what you actually get is a gigantic increase in MPS and a colossal increase in MPB. I mean, just ridiculous. So when you put these next to each other on a chart, you kind of, if you didn't have the MPB, you would think that traumatic injury was hypertrophic.
Yeah.
And you would also think your corticosteroid was hypertrophic, which is insane, right? So you've got to actually say, when you look at the balance and you end up with this massive net protein loss as your kind of output, and it's primarily because you are massively increasing protein turnover. At the same time, your protein breakdown has increased more than your muscle protein synthesis. So the thing is, without knowing what else is going on with protein breakdown, as well as muscle protein synthesis, you can't really just look, aside from that very specific scenario I mentioned earlier, which is like in the immediate post-workout period after a strength training workout, first 24 hours, yeah, sure, MPS is the only thing that's moving around. Yeah, you can look at that and you can make conclusions on that. Outside of that, and anytime you've got calorie restriction or sleep restriction or glucocorticoid responses from something else like a corticosteroid or, whatever it may be, traumatic injury, anytime you've got those factors playing into the mix or you're outside of that first 24-hour window, you can't do what people are doing, which is just to say, oh, MPS is elevated, therefore I'm in a hypertrophic state. It's like, no, you're not. You can't say that. It might be anything that's going on.
Even in that example, in the post-workout window, you could have two different individuals who might display somewhat similar elevations in MPS, but if you're not measuring MPB, one individual could have
Sure. So if
MPB,
it would depend on the, so if one was more stressed than the other, you'd have a glucocorticoid response, which means you get an MPB effect, which would be detracting from the overall net protein balance. Or one person could be on anabolic steroids, in which case, again, they'd have a reduced, kind of muscle protein breakdown rate. So there's all kinds of things that can play into that. But I'm being kind of like fair, and I'm saying, yeah, I think if you're just looking at that first 24 hours, the thing that's moving around is mostly MPS, if not exclusively MPS. But what you can't do is extrapolate that literature and suddenly start making claims like, anytime MPS is elevated, I'm in an anabolic state. I'm like, that is immediately falsifiable and absolute garbage when it comes to what's actually happening. One of the interesting studies I picked up, so all of the data I've just been talking about with, bed rest and fasting and all that kind of thing, that's all human data. So that's all human studies that were done decades ago. You actually get a very similar picture in animal models. So I always laugh when I look at studies in chickens. I don't know why, but it just it just seems funnier than looking at rodent studies. But anyway, there's some really cool stuff in chickens. The reason they look at chicken studies more recently, I mean, obviously there's the famous chicken studies of the 70s and 80s when researchers were looking at stretch-mediated hypertrophy. Later on in the 90s and 2000s, most of the chicken studies are actually done by people who want to or understand better the farming processes of housing chickens in safe environments so that they can grow maximally. And the interesting thing is that one of the variables that they look at in terms of understanding the environment in which chickens are most likely to grow in is ambient temperature. So it's a very simple thing to modify. So they measure ambient temperature and they house these chickens in a range of different temperatures, relatively close to optimal temperature, which turns out to be around about, sort of 25, 28, that kind of ballpark figure. And you get maximum growth rates and maximum net protein balance around that temperature. If you go outside of that range, if you start dropping down towards the low 20s or you start pushing it up into, over 30, you start to see a drop in the growth rate of the chicken. You start to see a drop in the net protein balance if you're measuring the difference between muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown. So that's what we see objectively in terms of muscle growth, chicken growth, if you like, if that's a metric. And you kind of see okay, so my chickens are growing best at this temperature, and I'm seeing the highest net protein balance at this temperature. Okay, so somebody who is, down the line, muscle protein synthesis is the only thing that matters. They're going to go, okay, so muscle protein synthesis should be highest at 28 degrees ambient temperature. I'm like, no, it's actually pretty much lowest. But if you look at the muscle protein breakdown, that's even lower at that point. So basically what happens is you start to go outside of the zone in which the chicken is most comfortable, and actually protein turnover increases. You actually get protein turnover increasing outside of that zone. But of course you end up with more protein breakdown than you do protein synthesis when you push into those less comfortable scenarios, because it's a stressor. So your glucocorticoid starts to create oxidative stress, which starts to create an increase in protein breakdown relative to muscle protein synthesis. So your turnover increases, but fundamentally you end up with less net protein balance. So it's really, really fascinating to look at some of this stuff and realize that you cannot simply say, oh, more muscle protein synthesis, more hypertrophy. That is absolutely not valid outside of a very small set of parameters, which are, as I say, the first day post strength training workout when you haven't got any environmental stressors or any other funniness going on, that it just breaks the link between MPS and hypertrophy.
So there's a few implications of that. Now, obviously there's the most apparent one, which is, okay, that makes it, I don't want to say more difficult, but it does add a layer of complexity in terms of looking at some of the literature and realizing or understanding what effect are we seeing when we're seeing MPS elevated in longer time periods post-workout, right? And obviously that's where a lot of this conversation is centered, is are we seeing this stimulus, persist 3 days later after the workout or not? And obviously we've done podcasts on that topic in the past, so it's probably not something we need to particularly dig into more here. And that's the most obvious kind of, application piece to this. But then there's the muscle protein breakdown part, which has been largely neglected in this entire conversation, sort of up until, I guess, the last few weeks we've been talking about in the podcast. And that's an interesting piece because it's potentially a little bit more modifiable. At least the MPS stuff, I think people understand how to modify that, at least from a training perspective. So you've given a couple of examples there, and we've talked in the past podcasts about hypercortisolemia being probably the big one, really, as far as muscle protein breakdown. What do we do with that information? What does that influence? So we need to be conscious of things that are increasing cortisol, for starters, I guess. And, we've talked about chronic sleep, I guess, sort of restriction or whatever the language is there, negative sleep sort of affecting that. What else do people need to be aware of in terms of this MPB piece of the equation?
So excluding anabolic steroids for a moment, this is largely about whether something is experienced as a stressor. So any stressor is going to produce that glucocorticoid response, which is going to produce an oxidative stress effect inside the muscle fibers, which is going to lead to muscle protein breakdown rates increasing. So whether it's a life stress event or obviously insufficient sleep falls into that category, whatever it may be, is going to, an excessive caloric restriction is one of those stressors. And where you draw the line, people ask me all the time, it's precisely how many calories is excessive? How many calories, being restricted is excessive? And I'm like, well, it depends on how you experience it. So people love to have these arguments about, somebody who's got a higher body fat percentage could have a higher deficit. I'm like, could they? Ask them. How do they feel when they're doing it? Because that's your metric. That's your primary metric. It's like, if you're entering into a caloric deficit and you feel absolutely horrific, that's a pretty good indication that you are experiencing a stressor, because, feelings are kind of how we kind of interact with the world. So it's like if you're experiencing a really, really horrible time when you're going through a calorie deficit, then you're probably stressed. You're probably experiencing a stress, or you've probably got a glucocorticoid response going on. So yeah, sure. If somebody is, at the higher end of the body fat percentage spectrum and they are using a huge deficit and they're not feeling horrible, fantastic. That's great. They're probably not losing muscle mass as a result. I think people have got to get away from this idea that they can just go, oh, this person with this percentage, they can do that. And I'm like, no, it's not like that. It's like, what is the experience for them? You've absolutely got to do this from a psychological point of view, because that is the reality. It's like, over the last couple of years, I've managed to get people to understand that, the effort perception is the important factor, and that we're dealing with a brain level phenomenon. So ultimately, your maximum tolerable perception of effort is what stops you from pushing motor unit recruitment any further. Okay, I think people are now more or less got that. This is the same thing. We've got to move in that same direction with this. It's like, a calorie deficit, it's not about the numbers on the page. It's about what it feels like. If it feels horrible, then yes, you have probably got a stress, or you've probably got a glucocorticoid response. If it doesn't feel horrible, you probably haven't. So yeah, the person with, sort of 30% body fat who wants to lose weight quickly may or may not be able to use a large calorie deficit and still maintain muscle mass. They've just got to try different calorie deficits until they figure out what they can get away with without feeling really, really horrible in the process. So I just want people to move away from this idea of saying, oh, it's got to be a number on a page and this person can do this and this person can do that. No, it doesn't work like that.
Now, the next piece of this, so if you're saying that ultimately this is coming down to this, I guess, net protein balance and what we're seeing is the combination of MPS and MPB, then theoretically one could have lower levels of MPS but actually see larger net growth if they've got a reduction of the lower levels of MPB. So in that regard, obviously you've talked about things that are going to exacerbate.
Just to kind of give you two examples where that will happen.
Yeah.
So somebody with lower daily physical activity levels will experience that. So you could have two different people. One person is highly physically active and doing a not great workout program, and the other person is very, very sedentary and doing an amazing workout program. So somebody's doing like a classic, every other day, full body, targeting loads of different muscle regions, but in between that, they're just sitting playing video games. The other person is, maybe walking around all day, highly physically active job, and then doing like a body part split program. The person who's literally, what you're going to see there is that your net protein balance for the person who's playing video games and doing an every other day workout is going to be higher than the person who's doing the poor program with a lot of physical activity, but turnover is going to be a lot higher in the person who's doing the higher levels of physical activity. But straight away you would see that being the discrepancy there. Same thing again would apply whether you pick two people, one who's more stressed than the other. So you got a really stressed person with really bad sleep, they would be experiencing a much bigger protein probably turnover and definitely higher protein breakdown compared to the person who's not so stressed. So that would be two examples of exactly what you're describing there.
And in that second example, what's interesting is they could actually be tackling, I guess, that problem from the MPS standpoint. They could be focusing on, enhancing the workouts, optimizing workouts, getting the highest sort of MPS post-workout sort of spike possible. But ultimately, the bottleneck, in a sense, is going to be muscle protein breakdown.
Well, yeah, once you fix the workout plan, everything is just going to come down to lifestyle and what's being experienced.
Yeah. So is there anything else that will modify muscle protein breakdown beyond taking away some of those stresses?
Not that fall into my area of expertise, no. I'm sure there probably are things, but that would be outside of maybe there are some supplements that people can, chip in with. But that is just not inside my area of expertise. It's not what I read.
Beyond anabolics, which you mentioned before.
Beyond anabolics, which I think is very, very interesting in this context.
And so how much is muscle protein breakdown? How much is that influencing the rate of atrophy? Is it influencing how quickly the atrophy is occurring or when it occurs, or what is it influencing from an atrophy perspective?
So, ultimately, the net protein balance is the thing that affects the atrophy rate. So you can have like higher or lower levels of MPS and MPB, and it doesn't tell you anything in and of itself. It's like, what's the balance of the two coming out at? Having said that, if you look at the group of people in the literature that lose muscle mass fastest, it's people who are experiencing hypercortisolemia, usually because of a traumatic injury. So they're in bed rest, so you're starting off with a pretty low level of MPS anyway, and then you dump in this hypercortisolemia and you get a massive increase in MPB. That actually pushes the MPS back up again a little bit, but you're starting from a low level. So that's the group of people in the literature that lose muscle mass fastest. They lose muscle mass a lot faster than people who are just in bed rest without the injury in place.
So assuming that we're seeing more MPB than we are MPS, and so we're going to see loss occur, then if we push up that muscle protein breakdown, it's not that we're going to see loss occur like at a quicker time point. What we're going to see is just more loss occur. So it's not that someone does a training session, MPS is elevated, and then with a high level of muscle protein breakdown, they start seeing atrophy occur earlier. It's simply when they start seeing atrophy occur.
Yeah, it would be a background effect. It would be a background effect, yeah. So if we look, as I say, if we look at the traumatic injury stuff, and just as an aside, before I answer the question you posed, I know that some people will say that the muscle protein breakdown rates being elevated in traumatic injury are doing damage repair and therefore we can ignore them. No, you can't, because you're actually measuring muscle loss as well. So if you have two groups of people, one group is just in bed and experiencing muscle loss because of immobilization-induced reductions in MPS, you can compare the rate of muscle loss in that group with another group that has experienced a traumatic injury or experimental hypercortisolemia. You'll get the same answer. And the second group, which is experiencing the cortisol-induced effects of muscle protein breakdown, will lose whole body muscle mass faster than the other group. It's got nothing to do with breakdown rates being elevated due to muscle damage repair, which is definitely happening, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about whole body muscle loss being faster in that second group. So yeah, it's absolutely a thing, but it would be a background effect. So it would be happening all the time. So you would go into your workout with a level of MPB that was already higher, and that would then just be suppressing the impact of your MPS elevation in the 24 hours post-workout. So you would end up with a smaller post-workout stimulus net as a result of your background MPB being higher.
So there would actually be a crossover period where at a certain point that MPS, when it's coming back down, it's going to the net
crossover the net point.
Probably earlier point.
Earlier than it would, yes. Yes, it would, yeah.
So that could actually influence how long that stimulus period was for an individual.
Yeah, so you could argue that somebody who is experiencing that elevation in MPB might be better off doing kind of daily workouts that are really, really kind of minimally damaging in order to try and maximally retain muscle mass.
Which is a conversation we had last week about string guiding.
Whether they be open to that is a separate question. Because if your glucocorticoid response is that high, you're probably not open to those kind of conversations.
So where does anabolics land us? Ultimately that's what I'm trying to get at here in terms of, well, if we're influencing this muscle protein breakdown, what impact is that having on atrophy? So it's changing that crossover period we've just identified there. Now, to what magnitude is doing that? Are we talking a matter of a few hours? Like how long might that magnitude be or that difference be?
Let's back up and just kind of provide the context for people, with anabolics. So you and I have been talking about how anabolics affect the strength training process for quite a while now. And obviously there's a really pivotal study that you actually dug out at the beginning, and I kind of it really changed the way I thought about anabolics. We've basically had, I think it was a rabbit model, and they had obviously a systemic effect from the anabolics, but what they did was they immobilized one limb and not the other limb. And so the really cool thing about that model is that you get growth happening across the whole body due to the anabolic steroid effect, but the immobilization removes all the mechanical tension stimulus from one of the limbs. Now, one way of thinking about anabolics is that anabolics completely remove any possibility for a atrophy effect to happen. So if you believe that, which I once did, if you believe that, then this study doesn't make any sense, because what happened was that the immobilized limb grew slower than the non-immobilized limb. And that implied that it was actually losing muscle mass due to the absence of mechanical tension stimulus. Well, you can't do that if you have removed any, kind of impact of atrophy as a result of taking the anabolic steroid. So ultimately, that rabbit study, that rabbit model was really influential in understanding how we see anabolic steroids and how they work. They're actually a parallel track. I think where we got to is that they're a parallel track to the mechanical tension stimulus from exercise, and you basically just treat them as two separate things and they add on top of each other. So, but I think where we're getting to now, the more time we spend looking at muscle protein breakdown and the effects of anabolics on that, is that previous model that we described only applies when you're modifying MPS and not modifying MPB. So if you look at that rabbit model, it's an immobilization model. So you don't have an MPB increase, really. You have a big drop in MPS as a result of immobilization. So your anabolic steroid doesn't fix all of that because it's an MPS issue that is additive. You've got a little bit of MPS from the exercise, you've got a little bit of MPS from the anabolics, like we see in the human studies. When they do a human study with one group takes anabolics, one group takes anabolics and does strength training, and a third group just does strength training. And you basically get, the anabolics group and the strength training group get the same amount of muscle mass increases, and the combined group get double the amount of strength. So they're literally just additive. So the human data sort of sit really well with the animal model data in this respect, as long as you're only talking about MPS, or your models are only dependent on changes in MPS, I should say. If we now look at things where the models are being changed by glucocorticoid responses, then I think things are going to be slightly different, because anabolics have a very unique effect insofar as they actually start to act antagonistically on glucocorticoids. And that's something that exercise can't do. So if you have a scenario where you would start to apply an anabolic in an environment where, somebody was, and they've done this in traumatic injury studies as well, by the way, you can look at that scenario and it actually starts to have a really pronounced effect on the muscle protein breakdown. So I think what we would we'd have to modify our model now to say anabolics probably have we've said this actually in the calorie restriction podcast that we did. We said this in the sleep restriction. People who are using anabolics, even if it's only TRT, are going to find that they just don't experience the negative issues of sleep restriction or calorie restriction like people who are not using those compounds. Because essentially what happens is the anabolic steroid acts as an antagonist against the glucocorticoid and stops it from having the negative effect on protein breakdown. So they just don't. This doesn't resonate with them. They look at this and go, that's just not happening. I'm like, no, I'm sure it's not. But it is for everybody else. Yeah. So I think we've got to modify the way we think about these things and say, in the normal strength training scenario where you've got no major stressors, no sleep restriction, no calorie restriction, then you can literally just look at this as an MPS problem, and the AAS and the strength training are just going to have two MPS modifying effects, and they're just going to be additive. And that's the simple way of viewing it, and that's totally valid. When you then shift into territory of talking about scenarios where you've got a severe calorie deficit or sleep loss or a stressor or anything like that, now the anabolic is going to be disproportionately more powerful compared to anything else you can do, because it is going to stop that MPB from increasing in a way that strength training can't do.
Yeah, that's interesting. Hey, so does that influence, and I don't think it does, but does it change anything in terms of what we've been talking about, how we would program for someone on anabolics? Ultimately, in the past, we've said, well, it doesn't really change. You would program a good program for someone who's not on anabolics would be a good program for someone who is on anabolics. Does that influence any of those parameters?
I think it means that there are far fewer things to worry about in a competition prep period or a dieting period. So, bodybuilders who are in competition prep or people who are dieting down, they're just not going to need to worry so much about the effects of stressors, the effects of sleep loss, anything like that is just not going to hit them anywhere near. It's like this solves the problem of why we were seeing some weirdnesses with anabolics in dieting situations before, and they didn't quite stack up with how we were expecting them to behave. They have this disproportionately powerful effect, I think, in those dieting periods where you just don't get that glucocorticoid response that you would do in somebody who's not using them. And I think really that is probably, arguably, the single biggest effect that bodybuilders are getting out of them in the short term. It's just, you can just completely avoid all of that stressor impact completely. So really, I would say from a strength training point of view, it probably means that you can basically not modify your training program to make it less stressful if you want to do that. So let's say you've got a strength training program that you're using in the off season and it's hard work and you want to carry on using that in your competition prep period, then from a natural bodybuilding point of view, I would counsel you to bring the workout volumes down to minimal levels. Be like, just do single sets and maybe leave a rep in reserve here or there. The person using anabolics can probably push the boundaries and make themselves feel pretty horrible and get away with it. I mean, that's the only kind of minor thing that I would say would probably be relevant here. Yeah.
Would it influence when we talked about dieting or, insufficient sleep and any of these hypercortisolemic models, the conversation came up about, well, you could look at training every day, but are you going to be limited by your recoverability in those instances? In a situation where there would normally be hypercortisol and the anabolics are mitigating that effect, potentially they're going to mitigate some of that recovery negative impact there as well then. So they would potentially be enhancing recovery in a higher stress situation. No?
Yeah. So what we tend to see with anabolics is, and I know that in the past I've said that I don't think anabolics accelerate muscle repair. I think they actually probably do. I don't think it's a huge effect, but I think they probably do. So yeah, I think that you probably get a slightly faster, but again, what we're talking about here is two separate things. If you're comparing literally somebody with no stressors in a calorie balance state, and you've got two groups of people who qualify for that description. One of the groups takes anabolic steroids. I think they're going to experience muscle damage repair at a slightly faster rate than the group that is not taking anabolic steroids. I don't think it's going to be massive, but I think it will be there. In contrast, if you now transport those two groups and say, we're now in severe calorie deficits, we've got stressors going on, then the problem with glucocorticoids is they massively suppress the inflammation response in the post-workout period, which is a major component to the post-workout repair process. The anabolic is going to stop that happening. So I would argue that when we're talking about repair post-workout happening, the effect is going to be a lot bigger when you're comparing people who are in, severe calorie restriction and maybe even stressful scenarios than if you're just comparing two groups of people in, unstressed calorie balance scenarios. So again, disproportionately beneficial effects from the point of view of anabolics when you're talking about an antagonist effect on glucocorticoids.
So I guess essentially where you're landing there is that someone on anabolics ultimately doesn't need to, and you said this before, adjust their training program around higher cortisol situations.
No, because they're not experiencing that.
Yeah. But someone who's natural, that's going to be something, again, a huge number of things you can do to modify that, but there are a couple of considerations that one might have that could mitigate some of that, and they're just simply not going to be that relevant to someone who's enhanced. Yeah,
exactly. So I think they can kind of carry on doing what they were doing in the off season, and largely it's going to take care of itself. It's not going to modify very much. In contrast, the person who is not doing that, the person who's remaining natural, is going to find they hit the hard part of the calorie deficit where, it's starting to be a stressor, and the wheels just come off. Absolutely, the wheels just come off because they can't recover in time, and muscle mass is being lost, and they can't stop it being lost. And it's really, really difficult. So that's when you need to start modifying stuff, reducing the volume of the workout, maybe thinking about increasing the frequency if you can, and obviously mitigating stressors as hard as you possibly can in all directions. That's where the hard work is. I think really the anabolics are making that all very, very easy for people who choose to use them.
There's just more moving parts for the natural.
Totally.
Well, if there was a lot there, is there anything else that you wanted to mention or cover as far as MPS, MPB is concerned?
No, I just wanted to give people some of the background for understanding and context for understanding why, when you've got people who are saying that MPS elevations always mean hypertrophy is happening, or at least atrophy is being prevented, that is 100% not true. And it's really easy to prove it's not true by just simply reading a bunch of, different studies and areas of research that have been done slightly outside of the immediate obvious hypertrophy area. And also I've explained why the hypertrophy researchers have ended up making the error that they've made, error of assumption that they've made, which is that they can simply use this metric all the time and it means that all the time, and it doesn't. So hopefully if people can understand that, then that very common error will stop happening.
We dipped our toes in some interesting anabolic stuff, and it is a conversation we're going to continue in the near future. Everyone stay tuned for that because I know it's going to be an interesting conversation. So as always, thank you guys for joining us. We do appreciate it, and we hope you'll join us again next week for another episode.